What happens when country music royalty sits down for what should be a lighthearted morning chat, only to find herself defending her entire career against questions that cross every line? The tension in the studio was thick enough to cut with a knife, and before the segment was over, one of the biggest names in entertainment would make a decision that left everyone speechless. But before we get into exactly what went down, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us what you think about celebrity interviews that go too far. Now let's dive into what really happened. The segment started innocently enough. Jenna Bush Hager welcomed Reba McEntire onto the set with the kind of enthusiasm you'd expect for a legend. The audience applauded as Reba took her seat, flashing that signature smile that has charmed audiences for decades. Sitting alongside Jenna were her rotating co-hosts for the day, and the energy seemed positive at first. Jenna opened with a standard question about Reba's latest projects, asking about her return to television and new music. Reba answered graciously, talking about how grateful she felt to still be working at this stage of her career, how she never takes a single opportunity for granted. Her voice carried that warmth and authenticity that fans have always loved about her. Then one of the co-hosts chimed in with what seemed like a casual observation. She mentioned how Reba has reinvented herself multiple times throughout her career, from traditional country to mainstream crossover to acting to coaching on The Voice. It was framed as a compliment initially, but then came the follow-up question that shifted the entire tone of the conversation. The co-host asked if Reba ever felt like she had to compromise her artistic integrity to stay relevant, if all those reinventions were genuine or just calculated moves to keep the spotlight. The studio got noticeably quieter. You could see Reba's expression change, that smile becoming a bit more fixed, a bit more professional and less warm. Reba took a breath and responded with measured grace. She explained that every evolution in her career came from a genuine place of wanting to grow as an artist, that she never did anything just for commercial appeal. She talked about how country music itself had changed over the decades, and she changed with it because she loved the music, not because she was chasing trends. But Jenna, perhaps sensing they'd struck a nerve, or maybe trying to dig deeper for better television, pressed further. She brought up how some traditional country fans had criticized Reba over the years for going too pop, for leaving her roots behind. She asked if Reba had any regrets about alienating that part of her fan base. Reba's posture straightened. Her voice remained controlled, but you could hear the edge creeping in. She said she respected all her fans, both old and new, but she wasn't going to apologize for growing as an artist. She pointed out that she'd been in this business for over 40 years, and if she'd stayed exactly the same the whole time, people would have called her stagnant instead. The co-host jumped back in, and this is where things really started to escalate. She mentioned how some younger country artists have spoken about feeling pressure from the industry to fit certain molds, to look a certain way, to sound a certain way. Then she asked Reba, point blank, if she thought her success had more to do with her talent, or with fitting the image that Nashville wanted. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Reba's jaw tightened visibly. She leaned forward slightly and her voice dropped to a lower register, still professional, but unmistakably firm. She said that question was insulting, not just to her, but to every woman in country music who had worked incredibly hard to be taken seriously in an industry dominated by men. She detailed some of the struggles she'd faced early in her career, the doors that were closed to her, the times she was told she wasn't pretty enough, or country enough, or marketable enough. She talked about fighting for creative control over her albums, about standing up to record executives who wanted to soften her sound or change her image. Her voice grew more passionate as she spoke, and you could tell these were wounds that had never fully healed. Jenna tried to interject, perhaps to steer things back to safer ground, but Reba was on a roll now. She addressed the co-host directly and said if she was implying that Reba had somehow taken the easy path or relied on anything other than her voice and her work ethic, then she clearly didn't know the first thing about what it took to survive in this business. The co-host, looking somewhat taken aback but also defensive, clarified that wasn't what she meant. She said she was just trying to have an honest conversation about the realities of the music industry, particularly for women. She suggested that maybe Reba was being overly sensitive to legitimate questions about representation and authenticity in country music. That word, sensitive, seemed to strike a chord. Reba's eyes flashed and she asked the co-host how old she was. The question caught everyone off guard. The co-host, visibly uncomfortable now, answered. Reba nodded slowly and said that when she was that age, she was already raising kids, touring constantly, and fighting to be heard in rooms full of men who thought they knew better than her what kind of artist she should be. She continued, her voice steady but intense, saying she'd earned the right to be sensitive about her career, about the work she'd put in, about the sacrifices she'd made. She wasn't some newcomer looking for sympathy or trying to play the victim. She was simply asking for the basic respect of not having her entire life's work reduced to image and calculation. Jenna attempted to mediate, acknowledging that perhaps they'd ask some tough questions, but suggesting that's what makes for interesting television, that honest conversations sometimes get uncomfortable. She tried to pivot to asking Reba about upcoming tour dates, clearly hoping to diffuse the situation. But the damage was done. Reba answered the tour question briefly, almost curtly, and then one of the other co-hosts, who had been mostly quiet until this point, decided to add her 2 cents. She brought up a recent controversy involving another country artist and asked Reba for her take on it, specifically whether she thought the artist had been treated unfairly by the media or had brought the criticism on themselves. Reba looked at her for a long moment before responding. She said she wasn't going to comment on another artist's personal situation, that it wasn't her place and she didn't have all the facts. But the co-host pushed, suggesting that as an elder stateswoman of country music, Reba's perspective would be valuable, that she had a responsibility to speak up on these issues. That phrase, responsibility to speak up, seemed to be the final straw. Reba's expression went from irritated to genuinely angry. She said very clearly that her responsibility was to her music, her family, and her fans, in that order. She didn't owe anyone hot takes on controversies or sound bites for social media. She explained that she'd watched too many people in this industry get torn apart for saying the wrong thing or not saying enough. And she'd learned a long time ago that sometimes the smartest thing you can do is stay in your lane and focus on what you do best. She wasn't going to be baited into giving opinions that would be twisted and used against her or anyone else. The co-host seemed offended by this response. She argued that silence was complicity, that people with platforms like Reba's had an obligation to use their voice for more than just entertainment. She suggested that maybe Reba's generation of artists didn't understand how things worked in the modern era, where fans expected their favorite celebrities to take stands on important issues. Reba let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. She said she found it fascinating how the same people who spent the first half of the interview questioning her authenticity were now criticizing her for not being vocal enough about things outside her expertise. She asked which version of her they actually wanted, the authentic artist who stays true to herself, or the spokesperson who weighs in on every trending topic. Jenna tried once again to lighten the mood, making a joke about how passionate everyone was getting, and suggesting they all take a breath. She offered Reba some water and attempted to steer the conversation towards something more positive, asking about Reba's favorite memory from her time on The Voice. Reba accepted the water, but her body language remained tense. She answered the question about The Voice, talking about how much she'd enjoyed mentoring young artists and seeing their talent develop. For a brief moment, it seemed like the interview might recover, like they might be able to salvage the segment and end on a good note. But then, the first co-host, the one who'd asked about artistic integrity, circled back to an earlier point. She said she wanted to clarify something, that she hadn't meant to offend Reba, but she thought it was important to have these kinds of difficult conversations. She brought up how the country music industry has been criticized for its lack of diversity, and asked Reba directly what she'd done to help change that. Reba set down her water glass with more force than necessary. The sound of it hitting the table echoed through the suddenly silent studio. She asked the co-host to repeat the question, her voice dangerously quiet. The co-host, either brave or foolish, repeated it almost word for word. Reba nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. She said that was an incredibly loaded question, one that assumed she hadn't done anything and put the burden of an entire industry's problems on her shoulders specifically. She pointed out that she'd been advocating for women in country music for her entire career, that she'd used her influence to help get other artists signed, that she'd spoken up when she saw unfair treatment. She continued, her voice rising slightly, saying that while she believed in equality and opportunity for everyone, she refused to be put on trial for not single-handedly solving systemic issues that existed long before her career started and would probably exist long after. She'd done her part, she was still doing her part, but she wasn't going to sit there and be interrogated like she was part of the problem. The co-host tried to interrupt, to clarify again, but Reba held up her hand. She said she'd been patient up until now. She'd tried to answer their questions honestly, even when they were borderline disrespectful, but this had crossed a line. She looked directly at Jenna and said she'd come on the show expecting a fun, light-hearted interview about her career and her current projects, not an ambush designed to make her look bad. Jenna's face flushed, and she immediately went into damage control mode. She insisted it wasn't an ambush, that they were just trying to have substantive conversations with their guests rather than the usual fluff pieces. She said they had tremendous respect for Reba and everything she'd accomplished, that these questions came from a place of genuine curiosity and wanting to go deeper. Reba shook her head and said that was a convenient excuse, but she wasn't buying it. There was a difference between asking challenging questions and making accusations disguised as questions. There was a difference between journalistic integrity and setting up your guest to fail. She'd done enough interviews over the decades to know the difference, and this had stopped being an interview and started being a confrontation. One of the other co-hosts, trying to be helpful, suggested that maybe everyone was just a bit too intense, that emotions were running high and perhaps they should take a commercial break and reset. She smiled at Reba and said they could come back and talk about lighter topics, share some fun stories, play a game maybe. But Reba wasn't interested in resetting. She said that's exactly the problem with these kinds of shows, that they want to poke and prod and create drama for ratings, but then when it gets uncomfortable, they want to pretend it was all in good fun and move on to games and giggles. She wasn't going to play along with that. If they wanted to ask serious questions and challenge her, fine. But they needed to be prepared for serious answers and pushback. Jenna, looking increasingly flustered, said they absolutely welcomed pushback and disagreement. That's what made for compelling television. She tried to assure Reba that nobody was trying to make her look bad, that they genuinely wanted to understand her perspective on these issues. She asked if they could continue the conversation in a more constructive way. Reba asked what would be constructive about continuing when it was clear they'd already made up their minds about her. She said she could tell from the way the questions were framed, from the assumptions built into them, that they saw her as some out-of-touch relic who needed to be educated about the modern world. She'd spent too many years earning respect to sit there and be condescended to by people who hadn't walked a day in her shoes. The first co-host, showing some frustration now herself, said that wasn't fair. She argued that they were trying to hold someone as influential as Reba accountable to have the kinds of conversations that needed to be had in the industry. She said if Reba couldn't handle a few tough questions after 40 years in the business, maybe she wasn't as tough as everyone thought. The studio went completely silent. Even the crew members seemed to freeze. That statement hung in the air like a challenge, and everyone waited to see how Reba would respond. Her face went through several expressions in quick succession: shock, anger, and then something that looked almost like resignation. Reba stood up from her seat. The movement was deliberate and dignified. She carefully removed the microphone that had been clipped to her and set it on the chair. She looked at each of the co-hosts in turn, then finally settled her gaze on Jenna. In a voice that was perfectly calm and utterly final, she said she'd been in this business long enough to know when she was being disrespected. She said she'd survived critics, doubters, industry politics, personal tragedies, and every other obstacle that had been thrown at her over 4 decades. What she wouldn't do was sit there and let a group of talk show hosts question her toughness or her relevance or her integrity for the sake of creating a viral moment. She had too much self-respect for that. Jenna immediately stood up as well, her hands raised in a placating gesture. She apologized profusely, said they'd clearly gone too far, that the last thing they wanted was for Reba to feel disrespected. She begged her to sit back down, promised they'd move on to different topics, even offered to end the interview right there if Reba preferred, but hoped she'd stay. Reba listened to the apology with a neutral expression. When Jenna finished, Reba thanked her politely for having her on, but said she thought it was best if she left. She explained that once trust was broken in an interview setting, there was no real way to recover it. Anything else they talked about would be colored by what had already happened, and she didn't see the point in pretending otherwise. The co-host who'd questioned Reba's toughness tried to backtrack, saying she'd misspoken, that she didn't mean it the way it sounded. She looked genuinely distressed now, perhaps realizing the gravity of what was happening. She apologized directly to Reba, her voice trembling slightly. Reba acknowledged the apology with a small nod, but her decision was clearly made. She said she appreciated the sentiment, but words said in anger or frustration usually revealed more truth than people wanted to admit. She wasn't angry at any of them personally. She just recognized that this wasn't the right environment for her, and she was exercising her right to remove herself from it. Another co-host, who had been relatively quiet for most of the interview, spoke up. She said she understood why Reba was upset, but asked her to consider that walking out might send the wrong message, that it might look like she couldn't handle criticism or different viewpoints. She suggested that staying and working through the discomfort would actually be more powerful. Reba turned to face her fully and asked what message she thought it sent when women were expected to endure disrespect in the name of appearing tough or professional. She said she'd spent enough of her life worrying about how things looked to other people, about managing perceptions and keeping everyone happy. At this stage of her life and career, she was more concerned with how things felt to her, and this felt wrong. She continued, saying that there was nothing weak about recognizing when a situation wasn't serving you and choosing to leave it. In fact, she'd argue it took more strength to walk away than to sit there and take whatever was thrown at you just to avoid making waves. She'd taught her own children that they never had to stay anywhere they didn't feel respected, and she wasn't about to model different behavior now. Jenna made one more attempt to salvage the situation. She suggested they could have a genuine conversation about what went wrong, use it as a teaching moment for everyone watching about communication and respect, and finding common ground. She said Reba walking out would leave everything unresolved, that it would be better for everyone if they could work through it together on air. Reba considered this for a moment, and you could see her weighing the options. Then she shook her head and said some things didn't need to be resolved on camera for public consumption. This wasn't a reality show where manufactured conflict got wrapped up neatly in an hour. This was a real disconnect in how they viewed the purpose of the interview and what constituted respectful dialogue. She added that she didn't believe it would be a teaching moment at all. She believed that if she stayed, the show would edit the footage to create whatever narrative served them best, and she'd have no control over how she was portrayed. At least by leaving now, she was making her own statement, clearly, that she valued herself too much to participate in something that felt exploitative. The first co-host, the one who'd started the whole chain of problematic questions, finally spoke up again. She said that maybe Reba was right, that maybe they had approached the interview with the wrong mindset. She admitted that they'd probably been trying too hard to make it edgy and interesting, and in doing so, they'd forgotten the basic principle of treating their guest with courtesy and appreciation. It was perhaps the most genuine thing anyone had said in the past few minutes, and Reba's expression softened slightly. She told the co-host that she appreciated that admission, that it took courage to acknowledge when you'd made a mistake, but she maintained that her decision to leave stood. She explained that it wasn't about punishing anyone or making a dramatic exit, it was simply about drawing a line for herself. She looked around at all of them and said she hoped they'd learn from this, that in the future they'd think more carefully about the difference between asking challenging questions and making their guests defend their entire existence. She said there were ways to have meaningful, substantive conversations without making people feel attacked, and that was a skill worth developing. Jenna, looking close to tears now, said she felt terrible about how things had unfolded, and that she took full responsibility as the host. She promised that if Reba ever wanted to come back and do this right, they'd welcome her with open arms, and she'd have complete control over the topics discussed. It was a genuine offer, delivered with obvious emotion. Reba thanked her for that and said she'd think about it, though her tone suggested it was unlikely. She wished them all well and started to move toward the exit. As she walked, one of the producers rushed over, presumably to try one last time to convince her to stay or at least to smooth things over behind the scenes. But Reba kept walking, her stride confident and purposeful. She exchanged a few quiet words with the producer that the microphones didn't pick up, then continued on her way. The camera stayed on Jenna and the co-hosts, who stood there looking shell-shocked, clearly unsure what to do next. The studio audience sat in stunned silence, having just witnessed something they definitely hadn't expected when they showed up that morning. Jenna tried to recover, turning to the camera and saying they'd be right back after a commercial break. Her voice was shaky, and the smile she attempted looked forced. The co-hosts mostly stared at each other or down at their hands, the weight of what had just happened settling over all of them. One of the co-hosts muttered something about never expecting it to go like that, her microphone just barely picking it up. Another asked if Reba was really gone, if she'd actually left the building. The question went unanswered as the segment finally cut to commercial, ending one of the most uncomfortable interviews in morning television history. The entire incident lasted less than 20 minutes from start to finish, but in that time, it had gone from a standard celebrity interview to a masterclass in standing up for yourself. Reba had entered the studio as a guest, promoting her work, and left as someone who refused to compromise her dignity for the sake of publicity or ratings. What made the whole situation even more striking was Reba's composure throughout. Even at her angriest, she never raised her voice to a shout, never resorted to personal attacks, never lost control. She'd been firm, direct, and unwavering, but also articulate and measured. It was a reminder of why she'd survived so long in an industry that chewed people up and spit them out regularly. The questions that had been asked weren't inherently outrageous in isolation. Questions about artistic evolution, industry responsibility, and social issues are fair game in celebrity interviews. But it was the cumulative effect, the way they were framed, and the underlying assumptions that created the problem. Each question seemed designed less to understand Reba's perspective and more to challenge her legitimacy, or put her on the defensive. And Reba had recognized that pattern. She'd given them chances to course correct, had tried to answer honestly, and engage in good faith. But when it became clear that the interview was more about creating conflict than fostering dialogue, she'd made the difficult choice to remove herself. In an era where celebrities are often expected to endure anything for publicity, her willingness to walk away sent a powerful message. The incident raised important questions about interview ethics and the responsibilities both interviewers and guests have in these exchanges. Morning talk shows walk a fine line between entertainment and journalism, and sometimes that balance tips too far in one direction. When the pursuit of viral moments or compelling television overrides basic respect for guests, something fundamental breaks down in the relationship. It also highlighted generational differences in how people approach public discourse. The co-hosts, presumably younger than Reba, seemed to view aggressive questioning and putting people on the spot as a form of keeping them accountable. Reba, with decades more experience, saw it as unnecessary confrontation dressed up as enlightenment. Neither perspective was entirely wrong, but they were incompatible in that moment. The aftermath was sure to generate extensive discussion on social media and in entertainment circles. People would debate whether Reba was right to leave or should have stayed and pushed through. They'd analyze every question and response, taking sides and arguing about who was in the wrong. The show itself would have to grapple with the fallout and decide how to handle similar situations in the future. But in the moment, as Reba McEntire walked out of that studio with her head held high, she'd made her statement clearly. She'd reminded everyone watching that respect isn't negotiable, that experience deserves acknowledgement, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to participate in something that doesn't serve you. Whether people agreed with her decision or not, nobody could deny that she'd stayed true to herself until the very end. So what do you think? Was Reba right to walk out of the interview? Or should she have stayed and tried to work through it? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about the moments that everyone's talking about.